Okay, I'm recording now. So, I mean, for instance, you turn on the History Channel or something around when they're talking about the Exodus and or around Easter or Christmas, or sometimes when they start throwing those religious movies and shows and documentaries on, and inevitably one of them will be about the Exodus and the miracles in the Exodus, and they try to explain them away as naturalistic happenings or just imaginations, and they really didn't happen. But it's very interesting that we actually have extra biblical collaboration for the Exodus and for the miracles, specifically the plagues that God brought onto the nation of Egypt that caused them to allow the children of Israel to go. It's the Ipuwer Papyrus. It's found in the Dutch Museum, the Dutch National Museum. It's a 19th dynasty Egyptian poem that was written by a man named Ipuwer, Ipuwer. I think that's how you spell it. Ipuwer Papyrus. The Ipuwer Papyrus is all about the fall of the Egyptians, and it even talks about the Nile is blood, and the people have no water to drink, and they're thirsty because there's no water to drink because the Nile is blood, and it's talking about all the death that is around there. It talks about this, nobody has enough grain, that there has a drought and there's a famine in the land. And it talks about servants fleeing and running away from their masters. So it's a good extra biblical piece of history that points to the actuality of what we're going to read about in the next couple of chapters. These 10 plagues that God brings upon the nation of the Egyptians. Now, the number 10 is significant because remember, we get 10 commandments later. The 10 commandments, the number 10 shows how can I put this? The totality of something. As the number 7 shows God completeness in God. The number 10 shows completeness in humanity, right? It's the complete human number. So we have 10 commandments to show us the completeness of the law that God has laid out for humankind, right? Here we have 10 plagues that show us the completeness of the justice that God is bringing to the Egyptians because of what they have done to his people. Okay, does that make sense? We've got 10 laws, we got 10 plagues, and so on and so forth. Okay. It's also instructive to understand that most scholars see the plagues break down in 3, I would say 4, but 3 different divisions, because at the right before the first plague, God gives a reason for the plagues so that the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord God, right? Before plague number 4, he gives a slightly modified reason. At the beginning of plague number 7, he gives another slightly modified reason. So it breaks them down into 3 groups of 3. And that sets apart the last plague, the 10th plague, because that is a standalone plague, because it is teaching something very, very different than these other plagues. All of this is just preliminary to our studying through the plagues. We're going to look at the first plague today in chapter 7. Before we get to the first plague, we're going to look at the final confrontation between Moses and Pharaoh. And when God sends Moses and Aaron back to Pharaoh, this is Pharaoh's final chance. But it also is very, very significant in what it's teaching us, because it's not only Pharaoh's final chance, it's God announcing what he will do through the following 10 plagues. This final confrontation with Moses and Pharaoh is the setup for all 10 plagues, and it tells us what God will accomplish. So we're going to talk fairly extensively about that. And before we get there, before God sends them to Pharaoh, remember how chapter 6 ended. Moses in chapter 6, he's been complaining that God hasn't done what he said he would do, even though God did exactly what he said he was going to do. And Pharaoh reacted exactly like God said he would. Moses is down. Moses is despondent. And Moses says, God, why don't you send somebody else? Why did you even send me here? You haven't done what you said you're going to do. And God says, Moses, shut up and color. You're going to do what I tell you to do. And the chapter 6 ends with Moses saying, "For I am a man of unclean lips, how will Pharaoh listen to me?" God does not bother to respond to that question that Moses gives, because before he sends him to Pharaoh, he just simply tells him to do something. We're going to notice there's a change in the attitude of Moses and Aaron. I don't know what caused that change. I don't know what happened in that intervening moments, but there is a definite change in the attitude and the actions of Moses, because he never again questions what God asked him to do. He simply does it. So let's go ahead and read a little bit in chapter 6, and we'll talk about that portion of it before we get into the miracles and such. So verse 23 of verse 30 of chapter 6 says this: "But Moses said to the Lord, Behold, I am a man of unclean lips. How will Pharaoh listen to me? And the Lord said to Moses, See, I have made you like God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron shall be your prophet. You shall speak all that I command you, and your brother Aaron shall tell Pharaoh to tell the people of Israel, Go out of his land. But I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and though I multiply my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt, Pharaoh will not listen to you. Then I will lay my hand on Egypt and bring my host, my people, the children of Israel, out of the land of Egypt by great acts of judgment. The Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord." Okay, here's the first introductory statement, God's purpose for the first 3 plagues. The Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring out the people of Israel from among them. That's going to be a sign. The first thing that he's going to teach through these things is that the Egyptians will know that he is God. And in verse 6 is the key verse to this section. Moses and Aaron did so. They did just as the Lord commanded them. No more quibbling, no more complaining, no more trying to get out of it. God said it, they did it. That there's a turn in the obedience of Moses at this point. Because if you'll recall, up to here, through the first 6 chapters, Moses is a reluctant person. Moses is going to go his own way. He's trying to talk God out of it. When God calls him from the burning bush, it's how many times you say, "Well, God, just send somebody else. Can't you find somebody else? I don't speak well. Send somebody else." And finally, Moses says, "God, just send anybody else but me. I don't want to do this." And he's been hesitant to obey God this entire time. Remember the incident with the Zipporah and the son's foreskins, that Moses had refused to circumcise his own male children, even though God commanded it to do. God sought to put him to death, and his wife went ahead and circumcised him and threw the foreskins at Moses, says, "You're a bridegroom of blood to me," because Moses had been disobedient. And up until this point, Moses has been hesitating to obey God totally, because he's just like most of us. We hesitate to obey God immediately and completely, don't we? I know I do. Verse 6, Moses and Aaron did so. They did just as the Lord commanded them. Now Moses was 80 years old and Aaron 83 years old when they spoke to Pharaoh. Okay? So we see there's a turning point in the life of Moses. Whatever happened, maybe it was the talking to that God gave him in the last portion of chapter 6. I don't know, because of the way chapter 6 ends. Maybe God touched his heart. I don't know. But at this point, Moses is totally God's, to command as he wills, and Moses simply obeys. There's no quibbling, there's no arguing, there's no trying to get God to alter his commands as when it comes to Moses. So then we come into the portion that God tells them to go to Pharaoh. So let's read from verse 8 to verse 13. Then the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, when Pharaoh says to you, prove yourselves by working a miracle, then you shall say to Aaron, take your staff and cast it down before Pharaoh, that it may become a serpent. So Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and did just as the Lord commanded. Aaron cast down his staff before Pharaoh and his servants, and it became a serpent. Then Pharaoh summoned the wise men and the sorcerers, and they, the magicians of Egypt, also did the same by their secret arts. For each man cast down his staff, and they became serpents. But Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs. Still Pharaoh's heart was hardened. He would not listen to them, as the Lord had said. Okay, like I said, this is a very important passage of scripture to understand the totality of what God is doing through these 10 plagues. Now, it seems very familiar and similar to what happens with Moses at the burning bush, doesn't it? When Moses asked God in the burning bush, what if they don't listen to me? God says, what is that in your hand? Moses says, it's a staff. God says, cast it down. He casts it down, becomes a serpent. Moses runs from the serpent. God says, Moses, come here, pick up the stick again. Pick up that serpent. Moses picks up the serpent and it becomes a staff again, right? That's Moses' staff. We talked about it then. What God is doing symbolically here is showing Moses, and consequently, Moses was to do the same thing when he got to the nation of Israel in Egypt. He was to show them this very sign, because this very sign is symbolic of what Jesus would do in his incarnation. Remember, I've told you that symbolically, wood in the scripture is talking about Jesus' humanity, right? The serpent in that passage is the same word that is translated serpent in the garden, right? So what that passage is teaching Moses and teaching the children of Israel, that God's rod, God's staff would come down, become sin for us, right? Would suffer and become sin for us. That's what the serpent symbolizes in the scripture, both in the garden and there at the bush. And then after he had done that, he would become a man again. He would become God in his humanity again. That's the symbology of Moses's rod that becomes a snake. That word is nakwash. It means snake, right? That's the only thing it means. That's what it meant in Genesis chapter 4, or Genesis. What chapter is that in Genesis in the garden? Is it 4? I don't remember off the top of my head. It's what it meant in Genesis, is what it meant in Exodus 4. It meant snake. Moses' staff becomes a snake. It's a different word that is used here. The word that is translated serpent here is tanin. Tanin. It means dragon. It can mean crocodile. It's translated dragon most often in the scriptures, but it really means a reptile, some sort of reptile. It is broad enough in its use to also include serpents and snakes, but it's a much more broad word than the word that is translated snake or serpent in Genesis and at the burning bush. And it's very important that it is so, because it tells us something about what is going on. Because, the Egyptians revered the Nile River. Many of their gods had a place in protecting the Nile River and the creatures in the Nile River. One of the major ones took the form of a crocodile, right? If this word is being used as I think it is being used, and for instance, Pharaoh's hat. You remember Pharaoh's hat? You ever seen the pictures of Pharaoh's hats? The big hats. What's right in the middle of it? Anybody notice? It's a big cobra. It's a cobra. A raised up cobra. So it could very well mean that Aaron's rod turned into a snake. It could also mean that Aaron's rod turned into something like a crocodile. It could mean that Aaron's rod turned into all number of things. The word also is translated sea creatures in Job, translated sea serpent in Job. It's applied to Pharaoh in Ezekiel chapter 29 and 32, where God is giving through the prophet Ezekiel this prophecy against the nation of Egypt, and he calls Pharaoh the tanin sitting in the midst of the waters, the serpent, the dragon sitting in the midst of the waters. It's the same word, right? So it's a very broad word. And I think the difference is, and here's another difference. It's not Moses's rod, it's Aaron's rod. This is Aaron's staff, the one that buds, that's doing this. I think the difference is that God is announcing from the very beginning that he is going to destroy Pharaoh's gods, that this is a contest between the Hebrew God, who's the only true God, and the fake and false gods of the Egyptians. That is what's signified when they imitate what Aaron has done. Now, this is a bit of cause for speculation. You can look in ancient history and ancient literature, and you'll see that there was a famous trick that many magicians did to enhance their own power. They had learned, apparently, and I don't know if this is real or not, I'm just relaying what's in the ancient tales, that they had apparently learned how there was a pressure point on the back head of a serpent, a snake, where they could press that and it would paralyze the snake. And they would hold it that way and walk around with it like it was a staff. And they would walk around in public with this snake like it was their walking stick, when in reality they were simply paralyzing the snake by touching a pressure point. And they would amaze people by laying them down, and the paralysis would leave, and the snake would try to leave, and they would snatch it back up and paralyze it again. So it was a parlor trick that they had learned. So many scholars believe that they're just simply imitating and doing what they had always done. And the reason God uses this, Aaron's rod turning into the very same thing, is to show them that he was not faking it. He was real. Because if you'll notice, God is very specific. Pick it up by the tail. Pick it up by the tail. So that they would understand he's not doing this parlor trick that we're doing. What he's doing is real. But yet, Pharaoh saw enough to where he still didn't believe him. He still wasn't convinced, because his magicians were able to trick. Now, it could quite possibly be that God allowed Satan to have the power to allow them to do this miracle. Because part of what's going on here in the 10 plagues, and specifically right here, what this symbolically is teaching us, is not what Jesus would do in his incarnation. It's what Jesus will accomplish in his incarnation. You see the slight difference? The first one is what Jesus would do. He would become a man. He would take sin upon himself. He would die in that sin, and he would raise himself, or God would raise him back up as a man. That's the symbology of what God does with Moses' rod. The symbology of what God is doing here with Aaron's rod is giving the outcome of what will happen when that man, that God in human form, becomes sin and then becomes a rod again. Because in that thing, what Jesus accomplishes is he destroys Satan. He destroys the work of Satan. He destroys the power of Satan. He destroys Satan. It's the final defeat of the enemy, right? That's what's being symbolized by Aaron's rod and its devouring of the other 3 rods. Now, I don't know how much you know about snakes, and I'm not an expert, but I know some. I was a biology major in college, but I know a little bit, and I've played with enough of them to know a little bit. Snakes don't eat every day. Snakes don't eat every day. Some snakes go 6-7 months without eating. They eat large meals. Have you ever seen? That's why the snake's jaw can kind of dislocate, so they can get these large meals in, and they take a long time to digest it. So they don't eat every day. So it was a miracle in and of itself that Aaron's serpent and snake, if it was a snake and not a crocodile, but if it was a snake, that it immediately just devoured 3 other snakes that would have been presumably about the same size. That's miraculous in and of itself. But it shows the symbology of Jesus defeating Satan. That's what's going on here, and that's what God is going to do through the systematic destroying and the defeat of the major gods of the nation of Israel. Because the 10 plagues, as we're going to see as we go along, each one of them coincide with one or more of the Egyptian gods. Okay, so for instance, we're going to talk about the Nile turning into blood. Let's go ahead and read it, and then we'll talk about it. And you'll see, hopefully you'll see what I'm going to say, or what I am saying. Verse 14, then the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh's heart is hardened. He refuses to let the people go. Go to Pharaoh in the morning as he is going out to the water, stand on the bank of the Nile to meet him, and take in your hand the staff that turned into a serpent. And you shall say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, sent me to you, saying, let my people go, so that they may serve me in the wilderness. But so far you have not obeyed. Thus said the Lord, by this you shall know that I am the Lord. Behold, with the staff that is in my hand, I will strike the water that is in the Nile, and it shall turn into blood. The fish in the Nile shall die, and the Nile will stink, and the Egyptians will grow weary of drinking water from the Nile. And the Lord said to Moses, say to Aaron, take your staff and stretch out your hands over the water of Egypt, over their rivers and their canals, their ponds, and all their pools of water, so that they may become blood. And there shall be blood throughout all the land of Egypt, even in vessels of wood and in vessels of stone. Moses and Aaron did as the Lord commanded. In the sight of Pharaoh and in the sight of his servants, he lifted up the staff and he struck the water in the Nile, and all the water in the Nile turned into blood, and the fish in the Nile died, and the Nile stank, so that the Egyptians could not drink water from the Nile. There was blood throughout all the land of Egypt, but the magicians of Egypt did the same by their secret arts. So Pharaoh's heart remained hardened, and he would not listen to them. As the Lord had said, Pharaoh turned and went into his house, and he did not even take this to heart. And all the Egyptians dug along the Nile for water to drink, for they could not drink the water of the Nile. 7 full days passed after the Lord struck the Nile. Okay. This is very symbolic, what God is doing. It's probably not apparent to us unless we're well-versed in Egyptian history, which most of us are not, and I'm really not. I have read some, but I'm not that familiar with it. But I do know certain things. I know that there were the two biggest gods, the two major gods of the Egyptians were Isis and Osiris, the brother, sister, husband, wife. They were, siblings and married to one another. Osiris was the god of the underworld, the lord of the underworld. Isis was the goddess of the living world. Okay. If you know anything about the Nile, the river Nile, and the Nile Delta, you can go back and read that the Nile would flood every June and July, right? That's how the Nile Delta was built. And they looked forward to the floods because the floods brought new ingredients and new fertilizer to the soils, and it refreshed the land, and that made that Nile Delta and that Nile River Basin one of the most productive places to grow crops in all of the world. As a matter of fact, throughout the majority of the Roman Empire, the majority of the food that the Roman Empire consumed came from that Nile River Basin. Okay, is a very important thing. And the yearly flood, they believed it signified that Osiris was dying, sacrificing himself for the Nile. They believed the Nile was his bloodstream, because part of the flood, it swept up all these red particles, these red sand particles. And the swelling of the blood of the Nile also caused an algae bloom of red algae and little microorganisms that turned the Nile River into a rusty color. It was still, they could still use it. They could still drink. The animals still survived in it. But Egyptian mythology stated that was Osiris sacrificing himself, pouring his blood out through the Nile to refresh it and bring new life. Okay, so they celebrated the flood and the blood of Osiris every year during the Nile flood. So God takes that belief and turns it on his head. He's also destroying some other gods. There were other gods that associated with the Nile. There was Hapi was the Lord of the Nile, the god of the Nile. They had different gods assigned to specific fish species in the Nile, specifically those fish species that were consumed by the majority of the Egyptians. This is where they got a large percentage of their protein, if not 95% of their protein came from these certain fish species there in the Nile. And they had gods assigned to these fish species. Okay. So what God is doing here in this very first plague is systematically telling the Egyptians, your gods cannot do anything. Not only does God turn the Nile into blood, he turns it into real blood. Not the rusty colored silty water that they said was Isis's blood, God turns it into blood. And that blood, nothing can live in it. All the fish die. So he's destroying all of these different gods that are associated with the Nile River. This is his first plague, right? The later plagues are going to touch on different aspects of Egyptian life, right? We're going to look at the frogs. They had a frog god. They had a goddess who had a head of a frog, right? Who was responsible for certain things. But the first one and the last one are the two biggest ones, because in the very first one, he goes after Osiris, who is the major god along with Isis, right? They had a hierarchy in their gods, just like the Greeks did and the Romans did, right? There was the higher god and lesser gods and all that stuff. So at the very beginning, he attacks one of the two major gods, Osiris. You think this is Isis's blood? No, I'm going to give you blood. I'm going to turn it into real blood. You're relying on Hapi to be able to protect the Nile so that it brings life. No, it brings death. It's bringing death now because I'm God and they're not. He's systematically destroying the gods of the Egyptians. More than that, he's showing the nation of Israel that he is God, he is real, and he was somebody they could worship and trust. Because yes, they still believed in God and they still worshiped him after a fashion, but they had also gone after the gods of the Egyptians. We see that in Joshua. We see it even in Jeremiah. We're talking about they went after the gods of Egypt that they had fallen in love with. So the nation of Israel itself was also participating in these pagan worships of the Egyptians. They had been there 430 years. So they believed in these gods to a degree too. So God needs to not only show the Egyptians their gods are worthless and he is the real God, with the purpose that they will drive the children of Israel out because they have come to fear that God. And he's so successful in it, if we'll see as we go through, that when the children of Israel leave Egypt, there's a lot of Egyptians that go with them. They want to follow this God that has shown his great power over their former gods. But, and perhaps more importantly, he needed to show the nation of Israel that there were no other gods before him. There were no other gods beside him. He was God, no one else. And the only way he could do that is to show these mighty works to the Egyptians. There's a very interesting thing there at the very last of the chapter, that the people were forced to dig wells to drink water. Now, I never would have thought about that. If I'm not going to dig a well, that's a lot of work. But there's an interesting incident in history, and I know most people are not interested in history, but I love history. I always have all my life. And I remembered when I read this a few years back, I remember something that I had read years ago. And I was reading about Caesar's conquest, Julius Caesar's conquest, his military conquest, and his writings, his autobiography and stuff. And it's recounted that when Caesar gets involved in the Egyptian civil war with Cleopatra and her brother, right? Cleopatra and her brother are fighting over the throne of Egypt, and it's disrupting the grain supply to Rome, because remember, Egypt was the breadbasket of Rome. So Julius Caesar takes it upon himself. He's been declared dictator of Rome. He takes it upon himself to go and intervene and settle the fighting. And he chooses Cleopatra's side. There's a famous story where she smuggles herself into Caesar's quarters, rolled up in a rug. But anyhow, she goes and she talks Caesar into joining her. So Caesar and Cleopatra begin fighting against the current ruler of the nation of Egypt. I forget his name. It's been many, many years since I've read this. But Caesar and the Roman armies that he has with him, and we're talking thousands of people, thousands of men, thousands of soldiers, they are surrounded. They're surrounded in a portion of the city of Alexandria, right? They're cut off. They can't break out. They're cut off from the harbor. They can't get out. They're next to the Nile. And what the Egyptians do, they poison the freshwater canal that runs through that portion of the city. So there's no more fresh water. Caesar and his men have no water. And I remembered that I read that Caesar had the men start digging wells. And the men were complaining, as soldiers often do, that we're not going to dig a well for water. You know how deep wells have to be? But apparently Caesar had some information that they didn't, because within 6 to 8 feet, every well struck water. In other words, it was very easy to dig a well along the banks of the Nile River. I guess the water table is up very high. But it's just, you probably didn't even need to know any of that. It just interests me because it's another historical fact in the scripture that has extra biblical collaboration. I can't say that word. Something extra biblically goes right along with it, right? You read Luke's writings, and it's what Luke has been called the world's greatest historian for his level of detail and attention to detail that he includes. But this says to me that, you know what? Moses knew what he was writing about. This is not made up something. They dug wells because it wasn't that difficult along the Nile. And apparently the people knew it. And apparently somebody told Caesar thousands of years later, when he has no water, they're next to the Nile. So he digs very shallow wells and they all get water. So I think that's about all I got to say for chapter 7. Questions, comments, concerns? What did I leave out? What did I miss?
Well, I thought that was interesting that earlier that in the chapter that says all the water that was in like the jars and buckets even turned into blood. But yeah, I guess the table water didn't. I guess it didn't come from the Nile.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I should have pointed that out because, the fact that he not only changed the Nile into blood, because the Nile flood or ISIS's blood during the flood only affected the Nile, right? They could still pull water out of it. And, if you go to a river and pull out some silty water, you can set that container aside and the silt will settle and it will leave the clear water on top. So that's what they would do during the floods. They could still use the water. Yes, they had to process it a little bit, but it wasn't poison, right? So what God is doing is nothing will help. You won't have any water. I have the power over all waters, not just the Nile, right? Everything that came out of the Nile, the ones in the cisterns, the ones in the houses, the ones in the coffee pots, they all turned to blood, right? Killed all the fish that they were dependent on. So good point, Jenny. Thank you. Anybody else? Going once, going twice. All right. I'm going to stop recording.